So this is a clarification question. I've got loads and loads of other questions, but you know, I love talking about me, my wife will tell you, but that's not the point. The question I have for you, actually, we're talking about community sharing of energy, potentially charging your car on the east coast and power generators on the west, and that's fine for the grid. But within a community, let's talk about a community within a small geographical location, surely that community is bounded by the local substation?
No, at engineering and technical level it is,
Right.
but actually sitting behind that you have very, very non-geographic markets. So in essence what happens, you have energy suppliers, and that's kind of one of the most broken parts about the system, is if you go to npower, actually they generate the majority of electricity that they sell themselves. So they sell their electricity to themselves at a predetermined price, add margin to, and therefore you end up with the electricity, but that doesn't necessarily have to have come locally for you.
No, I understand.
So
Yeah.
the same way a community can own an asset, and that asset could exist in Scotland.
Sure.
And effectively, as electricity comes metered out of there, goes into the metered account of that community and nets off the consumption that the community use elsewhere. And it's particularly helpful in areas such as Milton Keynes, which effectively has put planning rules in place, which means there isn't going to be an awful lot of wind turbines. So it allows a community, whether it's a localised geographic one or a spread community by interest type, to actually take advantage of assets. And then if you can take the settlement around things like feed-in tariffs, and instead of settling that on the house, it's settled within the community, there's a greater chance that that community as a whole will take benefit from the assets that they either jointly own or individuals own within that.
But surely you can't export past a substation, can you?
Yes. But that's the whole point of smart grids, is the networks were designed, and this is moving to the engineering side, the networks were always very much designed for electricity flows coming down. The whole kind of ethos behind the term smart grid, which is a bit of a catch-all, is the principle that you now have electricity ebbing and flowing all over the place. It means that those who own the networks, like Western Power Distribution and National Grid, have to have far better controls, telemetry, clarity over what's happening in the network, so they can manage reverse power flows, so they can manage fault levels and various other things associated with distributed generation. But absolutely, it's possible. What you can't do is take the electricity and push it back up through the substation into the transmission network and then send it somewhere else. That's why I like thinking about electricity in terms of water, because it flows downhill, but if you fill that bucket up, it'll push the water back up, but only to drop down to the next. So it maybe only goes up to the substation, and substations will quite often have a 11 kV substation, will have a number of feeders. So it'll maybe come up that feeder, stay on the demand side of that substation, and off to other sites located off of that substation. Yes, if you have a sufficient volume, and as you put in applications for planning with Western Power or whoever your DNO is, they will make the required changes at a cost within the substation to allow reverse power flows and things to happen.
So, but nonetheless, as it stands today, that does actually define a community, in as much as if you are bounded by your substation and you can fill that bucket up to the top there, then actually that, and no further, then that community of energy users is actually defined by that geographic area in the substation. That's what I'm interested in, because that gives you then the ability to generate your data and to be able to create a demand-side energy management scenario based on net producers and net users of energy.
You can still do that non-geographically today.
Yeah, but I'm thinking, so in my community, right, my community of a neighbourhood, there are quite a few of us who generate power via solar PV.
Yep.
Okay. The DNO dictates that we must have no more than 4 kilowatt output because of this
Protection,
association.
there's GNET3.
Yeah, exactly. Nonetheless, there are probably within my estate, I don't know, 25% of people got solar panels.
Yep.
And that, you know, let's not talk about social division, but that's another thing that we can bring up later on. But, you know, we've got big houses with big roofs and they're all facing the right direction, so we've got solar panels and they're all making a nice, healthy wage out the feed-in tariff payment, thank you very much. But the whole point being that, of course, most of us are out at work, apart from those of us who don't have a job, and during the day, and of course all that power goes to waste. Now there are ways of dealing with it. I put a unit in which sticks mine into the domestic hot water tank, so it is in gas, which is great. But most people don't do that. It just generates and it goes wherever it goes. You know, it goes to the substation which gets hotter, presumably.
Going to move towards the question, or is that exciting?
Yeah. Well, actually, really, it wasn't a question. It was a clarification I was after, because it's an important point, because you can't. Yeah, if you can't get past your local substation, then actually that actually gives you an opportunity as well as a limitation. That's really the point. So based on that, I can talk about that later on.
Just one thing to finalise on that. There is the potential to do that today, but the bit that comes generally without objection is it comes at a cost. Is the network was designed about the electricity flowing one way. If you wanted to make it flow the other way, then someone has to pay for that upgrade at the substation. And generally what you say, well, if it's the people who want to put solar panels that want to take benefit of it, then either amortised or individually, they have to pay the upgrades to the substation.
My point is that you don't want to do that, actually. What you want to do is to make your excess power available to those in the community who don't have solar panels.
Yeah, well, so again, that's actually a DEC issue about where the settlement point is calculated, and at the moment it's done for accounting purposes on the settlement meter. If you actually were to move that up to the substation and allow you to share between each other, that would make it far more sensible, and I would fully support that.
Well, one of the things I don't like is the fact I get paid 3p for export, and they sell it to my neighbours at 12p.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, that's it.
Okay, wonderful. I think probably we'll end up touching around that in terms of communities and who uses energy, what defines a community, how can we draw people together in order to generate behaviour change, a bit later as well as. But just in terms of other clarification questions, we've probably got an opportunity for, say, one quick one, maybe two quick ones, and maybe one slightly longer one. Has anybody any clarification questions on the presentations? Excellent. Moving swiftly on. If I can post something, what I should say is also, today is being videoed, is projected over at the panel, and part of that is, to make sure that we can involve more people in the discussion, so that'll be posted up on the website. But also, as I said, we're tweeting currently, so we may have some questions that come through on Twitter, so panel be prepared to take some of those as we move along in the next half an hour.
I thought the tweets were just about to go before we were waiting. No?
The questions might well be about that, actually. We will have to tweet the responses. So I'm kind of interested in terms of where we might start the discussion about the vision and landscape of the future, and a number of you have touched upon it. But I suppose what I would like to ask the panel to start with is, what would you expect to see happen in terms of the landscape over the next 3 to 5 years? And if I could just ask perhaps a couple of new panel members to kickstart that. Jeremy, in terms of the council, perhaps I could ask you in terms of what you expect to see in terms of the changes. What's the vision looking like in 2 to 3 years?
That's something that we've been working on quite in detail over the last couple of years with our Imagine MK 2050 project, which is to try and imagine what is Milton Keynes going to be like in 2050, or what do citizens in Milton Keynes want the city to be like in 2050. And that's the point that we had a number of public engagement events where people were invited to come and give their views on what they wanted the city to be like in 2050. And the primary view, I think we can distill all the various ideas. We included, incidentally, quite a lot of representatives from the Youth Council. So we had some really quite interesting, if woo, ideas, like electricity generated from dance floors. Why not? I understand it does happen with piezoelectric dance floors. Anyway, you'd have to do a lot of dancing to power the.
So what were the types of conclusions that in terms of what it's going to look like?
The ultimate conclusion was, or the ambition is to have a net zero carbon emitting city in 2050. Now, that's what the conclusion of the groups was, that we want the city to be net zero carbon. Whoa, how does that happen? And now that's the difficult bit, and that is the point of a process called backcasting, which is, that's where you want to be. How do you actually get there? What steps have to be taken now? to get to the promised land, if you want it that way. I think it's interesting to, we did actually come up, or we have actually come up with a draft strategy, which is actually on the council's website, which is the Imagine 2050 strategy. It doesn't actually have this picture on the front at the moment because we're still sorting out copyright issues, so I probably shouldn't show it to the camera. But the point is, the picture there was actually, it's a picture of Milton Keynes that was painted in 1971. And it shows a number of things, and if you looked at it in the mid-70s, you think, wow, that's never going to happen. Well, pretty much everything in that picture, apart from the Zeppelins and the gliders do go over, so perhaps it's Zeppelins is the only thing that hasn't really happened. But it shows that you can have a vision now, and that vision can be made reality.
A long-term vision. So we've got
It's a long-term vision.
I just wonder if we can, just thinking about time. Does anybody, panel members, get any thoughts on the immediacy of this? What have we reached a point in time where we're expecting changes over the next 2 to 3 years? What are the short-term things that we can look forward to?
I mean, I think we need those changes, but sadly, I don't expect them to happen.
So the difference between want and expectation.
I think short term is very much driven by the availability of government finance a lot of the time. Things like the increase in PV we've seen over the last 5 years has been wholly driven by feed-in tariffs. Well, I say wholly, largely driven by feed-in tariffs, also by overcapacity in manufacturing in China, which has brought the price down as well, which is probably not within the control of the average Milton Keynes citizen. Can I just also say on the longer term vision, I'm actually not a believer in the next carbon zero. I think that we have to look slightly wider than just the city. And I think that a lot of the UK's energy is going to come from things like offshore wind and tidal, which Alan alluded to in his opening remarks. And that almost certainly means that actually, in terms of, well, not saying in terms of carbon, but in terms of energy, we will, as a city, and all cities will be net importers from the hinterland around them. It's how big you define the hinterland.
Perhaps this feeds into what Gary was talking about in terms of community energy, in that the city as a community and a community that's using energy can be seen as a wider community. So you are importing energy, but it will be zero carbon energy, yes, in a true sense.
Yeah.
So I mean that can be built into the vision.
Sorry, so the zero carbon probably is okay. It's zero. It's net zero.
Again, taking on the point that you mentioned in your very rapid presentation, thank you very much, comes down to almost energy use being transformed into a passive process. I actually drew a parallel between the waste hierarchy in terms of waste rubbish, things you throw away, which is the 3 R's: reduce, reuse and recycle. So you reduce the amount of rubbish you throw away. Stuff that you might consider rubbish could be reused, that means it isn't rubbish. And if finally you haven't got any use for it, you recycle it. Now the same can be true in terms of an energy hierarchy, and that the parallel could be drawn there, that you reduce the amount of energy you use. In terms of reusing, that can be using energy in a different way, in terms of drawing a parallel there. And the recycling is the use of renewables. So the energy hierarchy, you can draw a parallel between the waste hierarchy and the energy hierarchy.
Okay, so we're starting to get some ideas about what the future looks like, 2050 plan. I'm keen to involve other people in the discussion. Has anybody got a question?
I've got a question about lots of very good data at the moment, whether we can actually do better, and that is in relation to the energy performance of buildings. Now we have these things called energy performance certificates, which people are very irritated about because they have to pay for them and because they're lousy and they're not based on proper survey, because health and safety prevents you from doing the most basic things. So and is that data in one place anywhere, or does it just reside in estate agents' offices? And is there a scope for the use of things like thermal imaging cameras to actually assess how thermally efficient a building is, where a survey with a man and a pair of steps isn't capable of doing the job?
Okay, who wants to?
I was going to say, I think it's in Gerd's domain there in terms of increasing use of satellite data or whatever to make that sort of survey very, very
The thing is that you can buy one of these cameras, but it costs about 1,500 quid or something. So an individual isn't going to do that. Neither are they really going to want to pay somebody to do it for them. But is there a way of actually having the Google Street View car going around it and mapping the energy efficiency of buildings in a whole area?
I think you're hitting an important topic here, and my response to that would be the current setup of having to contract an individual person to do the survey in the home is very expensive and it doesn't scale. So we need to find solutions that do scale. Google Street View type approach would actually work. It might still not be perfect data. In a similar way, we are looking at satellite imagery to see to what extent that is feasible. And it seems feasible. What the accuracy is, who knows. I think we can get to better certificates, I would imagine, by correlating information from satellite imagery, from existing information about the housing type, and so on, to derive at a more dynamic, more accurate reflection of how the building performs. If that becomes available as a service, I think it could make a big step change. So, I mean, these are the things, that's why my argument about data is important. We are, lots of those decisions, we're not clear what the best decisions are very often because we don't have the right data to judge which alternative is best in some instances. So I do think that there is a lot of things we can do. Now, as a vision for my vision of Milton Keynes, perhaps quite naively would be, can we try to set something up in Milton Keynes where this type of improved certificate is available for every household in Milton Keynes? Wouldn't that make a big step for Milton Keynes forward in the right direction? Now, that could certainly be rolled out to other cities, but looking at Milton Keynes. And then, I am slightly pessimistic and optimistic in terms of the future. Pessimistic in terms of if we are thinking in grand visions. I very much buy I like the vision of a carbon neutral or low carbon city at a future point. But in the short term, I think it is up to us to do something about it. So if we say, look, this is an interesting project, we need to then identify where is the financing coming from, who are the stakeholders, who are the actors, let's pull together and let's do it. These things are not impossible. Similar around community, the type of community project you mentioned. It would be entirely possible looking at potential financing from the government, which hopefully arrive as part of the strategy which they announce, to then pull together. So it comes down to financing, it comes down to putting together the actors, identifying the stakeholders, defining an initiative, and moving forward. So in my view, we make progress, yes, by having a larger vision, but we need to, and it's quite possible to do very concrete actions But we need to pull together and identify.
So the technology's there. The technology's there. The actors, finances,
Well, I mean,
stakeholders.
we need to invent things as we go along to some extent. There are certainly barriers, not everything is ready, but partly the barriers are technological, but probably not too much. Partly they're business, finance oriented, and partly they're social, and I think we need to work on them. But I think we can do that, but we can't get sidetracked entirely by grand visions. We need to at the same time be very concrete and actually say, look, let's formulate a goal for the next 2 years. Perhaps relatively small scale, maybe ambitious, and let's do it.
Small is beautiful. From Gary and then Ian.
So, sorry, just touching on the same subject, EPCs I don't think are particularly loved by anyone other than those who do the surveys, and it's very much aimed at a specific niche, which is those people who are looking to buy or sell property, is where it comes into consideration. But returning to the concept of community, if you have a group of householders all within similar housing stock, if you can take the data that they have there and actually do a comparative, you're naturally going to have a mean line, those who are more efficient than the mean and those who are less efficient. And actually, as an ongoing process, rather than waiting until someone's going to buy or sell, to proactively do it is if you can actually take a community by whatever definition that community is, but with similar housing stock, and say, right, okay, this is the 50% of the people who are below the mean. Why are they below the mean? Is it because it's an issue with the housing stock? Maybe it's social issues that there's a larger number of householders. But you can actually work within those parameters. And personally, I would rather see the data not just used when someone's going to sell a house, but actually be a continual improvement process where you're continually taking that 50% below the mean and trying to push them above, and in turn you push others below the mean at that point, and again you have this continual improvement process to improve the housing stock and reduce energy.
And just a quick final point.
Yeah, to answer the question, yes, there is a central repository for EPCs. It's just along there, actually, in Landmark House. Landmark keep one. Unfortunately, the public aren't allowed to access it because of the Data Protection Act. However, local authorities can access it for the properties in their area. They're allowed to. As far as the value or otherwise of EPCs go, they're not perfect. We know that, but actually, they're not that bad. They're, as Gary was saying, they're reasonably useful for giving comparisons. One of the big issues we have is where houses don't actually perform according to what they've got within them, which is something known as the performance gap. And this is particularly true with new homes, and can be due to a number of things, which include putting in complicated controls that people don't actually understand how to use. To come back to the point I was making earlier, it can also be due to sheer bad workmanship, that a house is specified to have certain building elements within it and doesn't, because the workmen say, oh, don't do that, guys, massively okay, don't it? So that's the second reason. And the third thing that could be useful is to actually look at actual build data. As we do in the non-domestic sector on certain public buildings over 500 square metres, where we have display energy certificates, if people on existing homes also have to provide evidence of actual fuel bills to support the EPC, that might be interesting. Now, obviously, lifestyle is very important there, but there's another one there. Oh, one final quick point. As far as thermal imaging, there are some companies who will offer to local authorities to fly over all the housing in their area and take thermal images from low-flying aircraft. And it has to be low-flying, not satellites. But I think the jury is out as to whether the data you get is very valuable, because it tells a lot more about whether people have got the heating switched on inside at the time that the aircraft flies over. We did that. I flew over my house in a helicopter once with a thermal imaging camera to show how well insulated it was, and unfortunately you couldn't even see the house because there was no heat.
I mean, it just sort of, I don't know quite how you go about ensuring that this data does become available, but I think it's important that it does, because one of the things I talked about before was about a carbon budget for Milton Keynes, and you've got to have the data, therefore, to know where you are now and how you're going to get to zero carbon eventually.
Christine, you had a question.
Yeah, I'm Christine Thomas from the University, but also here as a citizen of Milton Keynes. Everyone Alan mentioned behavioural change, and going back to Gert's question of are people interested in energy, I would contend that most people aren't interested in energy. What they're interested in is the things that energy deliver. So that, I'm just thinking about, how you turn that on its head, and you don't focus on energy, but you focus on the comfort and convenience that energy provides people, and how you can look at social practices in terms of changing behaviour rather than actually measuring the amount of energy that is being used. And I just wondered if there are any kind of reflections from the panel on that focus.
And that also brings us into this field which everybody touched on within the panel, which is about how do we stimulate that behaviour change. So perhaps it's a good opportunity to bring Peach in.
I have a completely different, sorry to not answer your question, because my vision of Milton Keynes is slightly different, because I came just from Ireland about a year back, and it was a slight shock for me initially. Like I say, Milton Keynes is a city of roundabouts, so I really don't know how much CO2 emission which we do. That is also comes into the carbon capture. And I totally agree with modifying the redways. It's very, very important. Like I was using cycle all the time. I don't even need a car when I was in Ireland, and I used tram. Whereas in Milton Keynes, we can't live without a car, at least 1 or 2 cars per person. So we are talking about residential areas and solar panels, but we do emit a lot of CO2 by using transportation, which is a major sector which is untouched. So possibly we need to address transportation is one of the major challenge, how we are going to address by using walkways or running runways, because we do small steps initially correctly, then the rest will follow. And I also believe the larger part of education, particularly, it has a wonderful structure here in Milton Keynes where estates takes a huge responsibilities, like everything in a very, very close network. Like the schools are very, very, I visited at least 80% of the schools here. They are very well advanced in terms of energy consumption, and they use modern technology, but they fail to educate that to the students. So how the community gets, if I won't listen to, I shouldn't say it's in the camera, I wouldn't listen to my wife clearly, whereas if my child says, "Dad, you shouldn't do this," that embarrasses the people. Oh, it's really embarrassing. Yeah, it's. So I think that's sort of a culture to educate the child at a very small scale, like what is the energy consumption, what is energy is, oh, we shouldn't turn the lights off now, we shouldn't put the things on. So they're doing the small things correctly makes a huge difference.
And just for other panel members, just in terms of the pitch of behaviour change, focusing the argument away from energy consumption.
And you have to engage, first of all. In order to get behavioural change, you have to engage, and it can be at a variety of levels. I think what we've seen is the pounds per kilowatt argument doesn't really exist there. In fact, if we stick to that, we've lost the battle already, because we're part of an international economy, and energy is an international resource, and the price is going to continue to go up. So if we stick to that, we might limit the growth of the cost, but we'll certainly not turn it back. So it's actually moving outside that and engaging with people on things that they mean something to them. And that, again, that was kind of what I was trying to pitch in that concept there, is if you can get an insight to the way people live and make recommendations which, one, hopefully connect with them at an incentive level, but also going beyond that, some of these organisations they have trust with. Some people trust the supermarket. Sounds crazy, but what I would contest is most people do not trust their energy company. And I wouldn't argue that. I mean, the way the system is structured at the moment, where effectively they make the majority of the profits, more than 50% of the profits, upstream, where it can't be seen, and they talk about prevailing prices, and that's the reason prices have to go up. They're telling the truth, but what they're not saying is they set the prices that they're selling to themselves, and that flows through. So I think first of all you have to address the trust issue, but you also have to find an engagement. And engagement will be different household to household, and that's why I don't think necessarily communities are best defined by where someone lives.
Quick point from Alan, and then we'll just move to another point, James.
I think that one of the biggest influences on behaviour change is cost. That's why a lot of people, for example, will switch from one energy supplier to another. And so what we've got to do is structure it so that the low carbon solution to whatever the problem is comes out at being a lower cost, and therefore people are much more likely to switch to it, even if they're not interested in, say, carbon and all that sort of thing. They generally speaking, particularly in these times of austerity, cost is a huge influencer of people. But on the sort of the transport thing, people tend to drive, for example, because parking is very cheap or free in a lot of cases in Milton Keynes, whereas on the bus you've got to pay a fare. Now, the council is spending more money on parking and less money on buses. Yet it's got a policy of encouraging people to use buses, but because of the charging mechanism, it's actually discouraging them. So, you've got to look at that and make sure that the costings are such that the behaviour that you want to influence has the lower cost, and that will encourage people to go in that direction.
Can I just say for the record,
To a limited
I entirely disagree with that. I think cost is a dangerous assumption that we all make, and actually I think if you change that word cost to benefit, then because not everyone sees benefit and reduced cost. Some people will actually happily pay more for green energy and feel like doing the right thing. I think to say that everyone's cost driven is a very dangerous assumption.
I'll reply to your thing about cost because my PhD student who's just finished research on household energy has found exactly that the people who were on very low incomes were influenced by cost, but the majority of the people that she talked to at cost of electricity made absolutely no difference to them because they could afford it. And the people who use most electricity are the people who can afford it. So you're going to have a very limited impact by just going on cost.
I'm going to just add very quickly, it's horses for courses. There is not one size fits all as far as sandals or shoes, and likewise as far as behavioural change measures for energy. Some people, cost is very important. Certainly giving people not smart meters, but smart display units that actually show the cost ticking up in their living room as they every time, oh gosh, that might make a difference, because it actually, rather than having a direct debit where it doesn't actually matter if I use more or less, because the energy company still direct debits me exactly the same amount, and eventually, sort of in 6 years' time, says, oh, actually, we owe you sort of £527, we better pay that to you now. There's no immediate link between use and cost.
And there's some social examples of actually where people have been told that their electric shower is so expensive, and then when they see it as a macro cost, wait a minute, it's not that expensive. I'm going to have an extra 10 minutes singing in the shower.
Okay, Alyssa, and then so if we just start with Alyssa.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alyssa from Community Action. I was just thinking, maybe one of the ways that we kind of move past that thing about cost and that will help us with engagement is kind of reframing the discussion and kind of seeing people, instead of seeing people as customers and consumers, seeing people as producers of energy. Because I think then we can start talking about some of the additional benefits, particularly about geographic-based community energy ownership. And for instance, I'm working with my neighbours. I live just outside Milton Keynes, in a village, and I'm working with my neighbours to look at how we can work together to set up a community-owned woodland enterprise where we restore some local coppice, woodland, and produce our own firewood. And what's really interesting for me about that is it's not really the production of that firewood that's the most interesting thing, it's all the additional benefits that brings. So restoring an area of woodland and increasing the biodiversity in that woodland. Even just the simple thing of getting to know our neighbours and being able to work together on a solution. So I'm kind of wondering if there's something about kind of the scale that we've been talking about and kind of how we make sure that this notion of community isn't co-opted by the idea of energy not needing to be produced geographically and then consumed geographically. So that we still kind of are able to talk about the community benefit of energy production.
If I can
Yeah.
briefly jump in with that, I think absolutely one finding from numerous studies is that once you become a producer of your own energy through solar, you also very often change your attitude toward how you view energy. So there's a double dividend to it. You get free energy and you tend to change your behavior or your practices around energy. Pride, the attitude of a farmer, growing energy, harvesting, and so that is absolutely very important. And these are things we can build on top and we can support. And I think these can be extended to the community as well. And I think that's when community actually works. If there is this sense of pride and ownership, it doesn't need to be ownership of energy, it can be ownership of, it can be more a social good. I think that's why community energy projects actually work. Without those things, I would think they don't work that well.
Because we also had a discussion recently, because there's a proposed solar farm happening where we are, and the discussion is that's great in that it's a solar farm, and we'll probably effectively benefit from that in some way when we consume energy. But actually, what would be even better is if everyone in the village owned that solar farm, and the surplus that was generated was then used on community projects in the village. So maybe it would help us to set up a shop that we don't have, and so on and so on. And that would have even bigger impacts than just, yes, great, some solar energy is being produced.
I mean, what I sort of like to see is, be it solar or wind or turbines or whatever, perhaps being used not just by housing but also by schools or businesses, because I think this was sort of Simon's point that you don't need the power all the time, not always at the time when the power's being generated. Whereas there's a school near me, and I kind of think, well, if the school had PV or a wind turbine or something, they need lots of energy during the daytime when the kids are in school, but a lot of houses are empty then, they don't need power. But in the evenings, or breakfast time, the houses need the power, but the school is empty and it doesn't need. So the same turbine and solar panels could actually be supplying power to school during the day, but to the houses in the morning and the evening. But it needs a community scheme to make that work, that involves the businesses, the school or whatever, and the residents around there. And a village would be an ideal sort of place to make that happen. How to do it, I'm less sure about, but it's a desirable outcome.
Let me just point to the report again, which the government put out. These ideas are not new. They exist. People have been doing that. The report outlines specific barriers, skills, finding partners, lots of social, technological, business, finance barriers, and perhaps what Milton Keynes could do, and I don't like the phrasing or asking someone else what they could do. So I'm not pointing at the council necessarily, but looking at Milton Keynes is how could community projects of this kind be enabled, facilitated? What is necessary in the community, Milton Keynes, to make it easier for community groups to get started? And so there is required an infrastructure. What does this infrastructure look like, and how can we work building this infrastructure? Because then we don't have to set up these community groups one by one, but we can hopefully wait till they grow automatically, because we created the necessary conditions and the requirements and the prerequisites for them to emerge.
Very helpfully, that moves us on to the next point which I was going to make. So, which is, well, using Gerd's point then, well, what are the changes that we might need to make in order to facilitate some of the things Alyssa was alluding to there? perhaps, I know, Gary, you talked about
Yeah, this is kind of my soapbox item, that we can do lots of tweaking around the edges, and that happens at the moment. The community projects happen at the moment, and in fact there was a commonality between what you were saying earlier on and what I was saying there. The physical flows of the electricity do go from the school in the evening once it's shut down to the houses there, but they're all being settled on the second meter that's in the individual buildings. And the problem with that is we all still pretty much go to one of the big electricity suppliers, because the competition threshold to come in and be an electricity supplier is set so high because of the vertical integration where SSE, npower, Scottish Power set the prices for themselves, and typically will sell 80 to 90% of the electricity to themselves and only 10 to 20% go out into the open market. If there was an unbundling in that system where npower generator has to sell 100% of its electricity in the open market and then buy back from the open market, so maybe buying from SSE if it's cheaper, then that also creates an open market where a community could say, right, okay, we'll establish our own electricity supply company. We will net off as much of our consumption as we can, and if we've got any excesses, we can sell in that open market as well, achieving the real price of the electricity, not the scrap sheet off the table under the current arrangements. You actually see the full value of the electricity at that time, but also where they have shortfalls in that electricity, being able to buy back from the market at a competitive rate, and then you have a series of not just community investments, but you have a whole group of ESCOs, energy supply companies, located around the country, which are developed on an even playing field with the big boys. And that requires government change, it requires regulatory change, but to be honest, until such times we see that, it's my personal belief that all we'll see is continual tweaking around the edges, and it actually needs wholesale market structure change. Soapbox, off this.
No, I really
sorry.
enjoyed that point, because when we talk about the kind of community infrastructure that we need to put in to facilitate this change, for me, what that says is that there's some activism that we need to do, actually, because there's, we can call it soapboxes, but actually we need to get really, really loud about campaigning and putting pressure on.
Well, can I make you really angry now?
Yeah.
By extrapolating that just a wee stage further. Several times a year we see into the media about the domestic tariffs being pushed up, and it's horrendous, and we're all in outrage, and nothing really happens about it. And the fact of the matter is, when you actually look at the way these big companies are structured, they are positively encouraged by the running of their own businesses to push those prices up as much as possible. If you take any of the big six, their customers are split into 3/3. You have a third domestic, a third SME, and a third in the large customer base. Within those two sort of commercial customer base areas, the customers are required to offer forecasts again, which creates profiles against which their energy purchasing is done. And if they deviate vastly from that, then what happens is they get hit with imbalance penalties by their supplier. So actually the suppliers have guaranteed profits, because if people don't behave as they did and it causes the supply imbalance, they just claim that back. As domestic customers, we don't ask permission, as I said earlier on, we behave as we wish. So if the day's cold and it's darker than expected, the lighting will push the npower or SSE or British Gas out of balance. So actually, what they want is their customer base to be as heavily dominated by their industrial customers and SME customers, and as little as possible in their domestic, to the point where it's actually quite attractive to push your pricing up. And so let's say that we take one of the big six, and by pushing pricing up, they manage to get rid of 10% of their customers. It's a double win, because one, they take 10% out of their trading risk, but if they then go evenly 2% to each of the other of the big six, they've actually shifted their risk proportion of their trading onto the competitors. So it's completely back to front, where the incentive is, well, if we push the prices up, those who stay we make more profit from, and those who go take some of our trading risk away. It's obscene. But that's what we really need to change, and that is going to require market structure change, not installation of a solar panel or something of that nature. It's a far more wholesale market structure change that's required.
Can I just ask a question, I guess? and that is, well, it's not quite a statement, I suppose, about how in some countries, and historically in the UK prior to the nationalisation of the energy industry, there were strong municipal energy companies. Indeed, my mother, who's 90 next week, her first job was working for the Gas, Light and Power Company somewhere in London. And this was a municipally controlled entity. And we've seen it recently in Germany, where the residents of Hamburg have voted to replace the incumbent, which I think was a subsidiary of Vattenfall, the Swedish company, with a newly established municipal company. And is there any opportunity within, say, Milton Keynes? Because I'm conscious of the fact that for things like balancing between domestic and non-domestic, Milton Keynes is a much more obviously sized unit. You can do a lot more things than you could on an individual estate or neighbourhood or a small-scale community. Even probably more so than in a typical village, because most villages these days don't have a great deal of industry or commerce going on during the day. They might have a school, but that's about the end of it. That they are largely residential, particularly in sort of the commute to work area or something like that.
The struggle is you still have to back off to someone who's going to supply your own imbalance. Even if you get generation here, there's going to be an element of imbalance, and
I suspect they wouldn't do I suspect it would be market-based, but you wouldn't do much
and
generation.
you can't do market-based trials. You've got to make a market change. You can't select a region and say let's operate that region as a trial. There's legislation that prevents that happening. So it does actually need wholesale market change in order to happen. The closest you could probably come to is taking somewhere like Isle of Man, which operates its own energy structure, to run a trial out there to prove the concept works and get the buy-in at a governmental level to actually make those changes. But it's certainly not as straightforward as just taking a geographic area, because you have all suppliers active in that area, and you can't take away the right for consumers to choose. You say, right, everyone Milton Keynes business, otherwise you will supply by Milton Keynes Power Company for the purposes of a trial. You're not allowed to do that. You're taking consumer choice away, whether it be residential or commercial.
But we need to make some changes. I mean, I think the idea of having a local or a regional kind of energy companies are ones that are in some way publicly accountable, as opposed to the big six who are solely motivated by profit. They happen to generate energy as the mechanism for their main goal, which is making profit for their shareholders. So if we had a Milton Keynes energy company, I think it would be much better for people in Milton Keynes, because its motivation, its goal could be generating energy for Milton Keynes in the lowest carbon way possible, for example. But yes, it's going to need all sorts of legislative changes to enable that to happen. But that's not to say that it's not a desirable thing, But it's just going to be difficult to achieve.
Sorry, Jeremy. What I'm doing is delaying everybody's lunch. So what we might need to do just before we conclude, Ravi, I know you had a question. Yeah. If we just use your question, Ravi, as the last question, and then I've just got one final thing just for everybody to spend 30 seconds on, and then we'll have some lunch. I think most of the speakers are going to be around for lunch, at least for the next 20 minutes, half an hour, so we will have a chance to grill them on an individual basis.
I'm going to get a train in about 10 minutes.
So, and that's a kilometre walk to the next bus station as well.
No, it's a 2 kilometre walk to Milton Keynes Station.
Okay, so
if
we'll
it
try
helps,
and
I'll
make
run
this
you back to the
responsive
station if that means you can stay on.
You can use the electric car.
Ravi.
Yeah. So we talked on the energy saving measures. We talked on the household front, the buildings. We talked about the factories, transport. Now my question is, from a Milton Keynes perspective, which are the big ticket items which we think generate where we have the most potential to reduce carbon emissions? So should we look at households, or should we look at the transport bit? Should we look at the buildings part, or should we look at the small enterprises, large enterprises? Where is the maximum potential of saving energy?
Okay, so prioritise. Where do we need to prioritise?
Buildings.
It's well jumped in, Jeremy, and nice and succinct as well. Anybody else?
I'll go for transport.
I would get the transport as well.
Yeah.
It's very key, particularly from Milton Keynes.
That's right. Because we are so bad,
Yeah.
we're worse than the kind of national average. And so therefore there is there are more potential gains to be made, I think, in the transport sector. It's not to say don't do buildings, but I think in the particular circumstances that we've got this fairly modern housing stock compared to a conventional town that's been built to not bad standards, but we've got this transport network which is so car oriented that I think there's more to be gained, particularly in the short term, from changing the way people travel around in Milton Keynes, than there is from the buildings.
But can I just add to that? I don't think this is actually an opinion poll, because the big ticket items are those where we can make the biggest gains. And I would trust Jeremy to have looked and have the numbers to some extent, at least. You guys probably have sort of an overview where, but the question then is, do we, as Milton Keynes, have enough data to actually understand where the biggest impact for the lowest cost can be gained? If not, then maybe that's where we should focus at least some attention.
Can I play devil's advocate for Milton Keynes? It's despite the accent, I actually live just the Great Horwood, just outside, and I have to say one of the things that I've praised long and hard is actually the infrastructure that's there. People choose to get out of their cars. I'm a marathon runner, and the railways are incredible. I can as soon as I get in from Great Horwood to the end of the 421 there, I can run, and I can pretty much run hardly without seeing traffic to any other part of Milton Keynes. So the structure's there. So again, going back to what you were discussing, engagement. It's how do you get people out of the cars. I don't think it's lack of investment in infrastructure from NKC. I think there's something missing, and that's the motivation to get people out of the cars.
I was going to answer Ravi's question by saying all of the above. I think actually, but no, there's a serious point behind that as well, actually, and that is that I don't think we should be focusing just on one. I think we should be trying to do it across the board, because as someone pointed out, that there are high cost and low cost measures that can be done or actions that can be taken in each of these areas, and we should be trying to focus on getting a decent balance. Just to correct one statistic, in terms of energy per capita, or in terms of carbon per capita, Milton Keynes is below the national average on transport. Now, that's because of the fact that it's a relatively dense area still, and it's very close to the national average, and probably ought to be a lot better.
Yeah.
But it's before everyone's, and compared to say sort of a very rural county, obviously we're massively better, because in a rural county you've probably got no alternative to travel large distances. But before we totally put ourselves on transport.
Can I defend my one word?
Jeremy.
Yeah, it's easier to get to zero carbon housing and buildings than it is to get to zero carbon transport in a wider context. And in terms of the three carbon emission sources you mentioned, that's split pretty evenly between buildings, transport and commercial.
No, we talked of households as well. So we are looking at the smart washing machine with switches and switches behavior. So when we prioritize, is there a point in focusing on that, or if we think that even by switching on the machine, you mentioned about the unit, so we don't know how many joules, how many calories we are going to save by that. So we are better off looking at insulating the buildings and focusing there, or we focus on some other measures.
That's a different question, because you're asking which is easier, and
yeah, that's the second bit. So first is, do we have?
If you wanted the biggest bang for the trouble is with buildings, it's not sexy. It's difficult to get worked up about cavity wall insulation or very thick loft insulation. It's just not sexy. But a whizzy washing machine, that is the AAA rated washing machine, has quite a cachet to it. And addressing the aspirations of people, which is the driver of a lot of behaviour change, is probably quite a key task. And that drives things like people who are prepared to pay more for green energy. That's aspirational. That's sort of like, you know, speaking to your neighbour. Well, we get green electricity. It's aspirational. It's I'm living a better life than you are, and that is a difficult thing to change.
The thing that the thing I find really quite amusing about that is the deeply unsexy insulation is a passive solution. You can't use it wrong. So once it's in, it actually provides the benefits. Give someone a whizzy washing machine, they've got the override button, use it at the wrong time, it can still provide them no advantage. So I personally would suggest, yes, buildings, but also in the passive things that go into buildings that actually change the fabric and fixture of the building, rather than giving people whizzy things, because you can change householder, you can move people on. If you actually improve the fabric, those benefits will be inherent and remain.
Good point.
Just one bit, because I'm the guy with the washing machine. The actual savings which we realize through this smart start mechanism which we explored are very small per individual household, assuming they already have an up-to-date washing machine. And that is fine, because my motivation behind that is, once you have the model right, you can roll it out to 100% of the people who have a washing machine and solar PV very rapidly by building this into the washing machine. So, although the initial per household saving is relatively small, once you get the model, you get the savings multiplied by how many people are using it. So there is then, the question is, how do you move from the people who are switched on and care about these issues, and how do you reach the 90% of the people who don't necessarily care about this? If you build it into a washing machine, everyone gets it. So that's an interesting mechanism of scaling up, which is very difficult to achieve with renovation of housing. So I would say, if you're an individual household, do the insulation, don't invest in a washing machine. In terms of innovation, the smart washing machine might not be a bad move at all.
Okay, I'm going to close there. We have lunch, which is just waiting out there. We might need to just unwrap it. Thank you ever so much, panel members and speakers. It's incredibly insightful. It's all on video, and we'll be